lovely to be here. Really lovely to be here. I was saying I've been showered with gifts since I got here. I got Dan Chitter and a few others bought me a copy of Les Murray's collected poems, which is quite a considerable tome. I said that I wanted to read Australian poetry whilst I was here, and there it was. And then I've just been given another collection of poetry, and then gifts. And yeah, so it's been lovely. I felt very, very warmly welcomed. Maitreya has showed me around the city. We've done a bookshop, the cafe. Coffee here is as good as I've heard, I'm pleased to say. I thought that was an important bit of research to do. I arrived. I've been to the National Gallery. Yes, and I'm very, very impressed by the centre. I first came to Melbourne 26 years ago, when I was a bit younger. And it was in somewhere else, which I can't quite remember, but it was much smaller than this. And I was just very impressed by the site. I mean, the main shrine room upstairs is much bigger than the shrine room at the LBC, the London Buddhist Centre. And it's lovely that you've got the whole building, and it's just wonderful, isn't it? A wonderful resource. So congratulations for getting it, because, I don't know, buildings are strangely important. Even the size of them, they say something about how confident you are about your own vision. Don't they? They speak of your own faith in what you're doing, because to have a building of this size is an expression of confidence that your vision and faith perdures into the future. So I'm very, very impressed by the centre. Such a lovely centre, isn't it? It's a lovely centre. So, and I know that that's mainly the people. It's not a thing. It's representative of the people. So, congratulations, everyone. So I want to say a little bit. Maitreya took me to the National Gallery. I was very keen to go. We went to look at various things, but she said to me, "You're not going to talk about Jesus, are you?" I thought, well, actually, I was thinking of talking about Jesus. So we were in the National Gallery together. Wonderful National Gallery, isn't it? Have you been? Yeah, really, really good. And the collections at all levels are very, very good. It's also slightly poignant for me, coming from the old world, coming from Europe. There you are in Melbourne, and there's, Cézanne, and there's a wonderful late Manet. Manet, when he painted that, had gout. Basically, the bottom part of his leg had died. He was in agonising pain, and the surgeon said that when they touched his toenails just came off, and they amputated his leg not long after he did that painting, and then he died during the operation. He was only 51, so he's in terrible pain. And then you see this late painting of Manet in the national collection, which is this beautiful image of sunshine, and the reason it's this little sort of bit of courtyard, and the reason it's that little bit of courtyard is because he couldn't walk to the studio by then, so that he'd go and sit in the shade. And there are these very late flower paintings by Manet, very, very beautiful things. Anyway, I wanted to talk. I thought I'd just talk about. I was very struck by this Hans Memling painting, which is one of the highlights of the National Collection. It's only tiny, it's about 8'4", isn't it? So you can easily miss it. I was really struck by it. I mean, partly it's just very, very beautiful too, and I looked at it for quite a while. And I was trying to sort of talk you through why I found it. It's not the obvious thing for a Buddhist to be interested. She said, "There's this lovely Buddhist wing." I said, "I'm not really interested in that." She said, "What kind of Buddhist are you?" And I said, "Yes, I've often asked myself that question." I often don't find Buddhist images, especially out of a shrine room. I find them, I don't know. I remember we used to have these shows like Tibetan. There's a big Tibetan Buddhist show in London many years ago, and my friends would come back saying that they wanted to prostrate in front of the images. I found it just left me cold. Partly to do with them seeing in a museum context feels wrong, but also I think partly I don't, I haven't grown up with those images. I find them more kind of, what would you say, more, as images I think they speak clearer if you unpack them, but they, for me at least, they don't touch me in the same way as Christian images do. I was brought up a Christian in the Church of England, if you can call that Christianity. There's an Alan Bennett play where a character says, as long as you can organise a good jumble sale. That is my understanding of the Church of England. You know, as long as you can organise a tight jumble sale, that's it. But latterly I found myself strangely more moved by both Christian imagery, which I always have been touched by actually, and even by Christian writing. I've been reading Marilyn Robinson, who I think is probably a great modern novelist. Particularly Gilead, she's written a series of books that starts with Gilead, which is a religious novel of major worth, I thought. I don't know, but it struck me as remarkable, and her depth of thinking is remarkable. She's written a series of essays called "Why Are We Here," which, much of it I wouldn't agree with, but her depth of thought is is very, very obvious. I think one of the reasons why I've been more struck by Christian thought is because of this terrible danger for Buddhism of it being secularized. Secularized and technicalized seems to be Buddhism is always going to be prey to all kinds of cultural dangers, often coming from within Buddhism itself rather than outside of it. Bhante once said, Sangharakshita, the founder of our order, once said that Buddhism has got more to fear from its friends than its enemies, and in many ways that's still true. And one of the tendencies at the moment in contemporary Buddhism is to secularize Buddhism and to technicalize it, in other words, to make it into a technique, especially a meditative technique. There's value in both, actually, but neither particularly move me or touch me. And I think taken too far, they're actually real dangers to Buddhism. Especially for me, this danger. I think they go together. Actually, this instinct to secularize and then technicalize. Because if you secularize something, you then have to give it a new mystique, and the way you do that is to make it sound very technical. And some people find that very appealing, especially those of you with an engineering kind of mindset. People like to have all of those bits, and it gives it a sort of mystique. Do you see what I mean? So you've taken away the transcendent, so you have to do something to replace that, otherwise you haven't got anything very much. So I think technicalism comes along with secularism. I haven't thought this before. But I think that's what it does. It gives... It's a kind of way of giving Buddhism back its mystique through the back door. Bhante calls it pseudo-spiritual technicalism, and which is really very apposite way of thinking about it, pseudo-spiritual technicalism. It's very common in contemporary Buddhism. And you even hear talk of secular Buddhism, which really is an insult, I think. It's like saying secular Catholicism or secular Islam, really is stupid, especially in the mouths of Buddhists. So I think that's partly why I find myself more attracted to, in a way that I never was. I've always been, my own experience of Church of England was damaging, I would say largely, actually, rather than anything. Life-denying, self-problematizing, guilt-inducing, and so on. So it's not that I've been brought up with a sort of very warm regard for it. If anything, quite the obvious opposite. I felt very virulently anti-Christian. But yeah, I do find myself more drawn to it now in thought and in its best thought and in its images. So I thought I'd just talk about this one image in the National Gallery, then you can run and go and see it. Incredible that it's here. I don't know, what was it, 1460? It was painted in Bruges. Here it is in Melbourne. Incredible, isn't it? Just incredible that it survives, poor old things. They drag through the centuries, and we're very lucky to have any of them. They just that they survive. Wars and then being shipped over. And so on. And it's an image of Christ as the man of sorrows, with the Virgin Mary behind him. It's exquisite, it's tiny. The Virgin is sort of supporting Christ, although we were looking at, as you look at it, it's not so much supporting Christ, it's almost as if she's holding him to stop him sort of ascending to heaven. He's absolutely weightless as a figure. I mean, Hans Memling is an absolute genius of a painter, so the skin and the body is very incredibly naturalistic in a way that the hands you could paint now if you could. I mean, we've lost the ability to draw that well, but it's a spectacular piece of rendering, and it's very poignant because Christ is right in the middle there against the cross. I mean, remember, I would have found these images repulsive when I was young, and then the Virgin is above the Mother of God, above holding him, her head to one side, his head the opposite. And one of the things that's striking about it, they look like the same person, male and female version of the same person. If you look at their faces, they look like twins or something. They don't like. As often, the Madonna is not shown as being any older than Christ. He's got the wound from the spear, and it's basically trying to show the wounds, and you would pray in front of it, and that would have all sorts of beneficial effects. So I don't want to go into the theology, because the problem that when you start to unpack the theology, it's hugely problematic, because the fact that those wounds were caused by you, effectively, because of man's fallen state, because of Adam's sin and Eve's sin, very complicated theology, which I don't have an inch of sympathy for in many ways. But the image of suffering, I even like that name, the Man of Sorrows. I always think of Handel's playing of it in the Messiah, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. That's right, And what that's getting at, I think, is what's so poignant about the painting is just that sense of suffering, and because it's painted so beautifully and sympathetically, it's interesting. It's not a morbid painting at all. It's actually jewel-like and beautiful. The Madonna's face particularly is very beautiful. This beautiful sort of sadness and reflection, and Christ's face, clearly Christ is supposed to be dead and alive at the same time. It's quite interesting. His eyes are open, so he looks alive, but he's clearly supposed to be dead, which is interesting. But so the thing that struck me first of all is just the sort of pain, and Memling makes it more. He goes all the way. So they're leaning against the cross, and then next to them is a pillar that Christ was scourged on, and then there's the spear, and the for those of you who know the Christmas story, what is it? I never say lemonade. It's not. What do they put in his side? Vinegar. The sponge of vinegar. I was going to say lemonade or something. That's not right. And then there's all these disembodied hands which are his mocking. Incredible how he's done them. They're just hands on their own with no attempt to. They're just emblematic things of all the suffering. Yeah. So it's a picture of suffering. A mother's son suffering for her tortured child. Of course, we were talking, weren't we, on the way from the airport about torture, and that's a very real thing. And don't think that's something that happened in the past. So unbearable. If you think of it, if you take it away, if you look at it just as an image, it's an image of unbearable suffering, physical suffering, emotional suffering, torture, and so on. The worst sufferings that human beings can experience. And there's the beautiful face of the Madonna with tears in her cheeks. Of course, you have to. My understanding of suffering is not a Christian understanding of suffering. The danger of that image is to dignify suffering, to make suffering into somehow as a good thing. And Christianity, at least those images have been used in that way, to make suffering good in itself. And suffering isn't good in itself. One should never dignify suffering. One should try to alleviate it by any means possible. You see the danger of the image if you start thinking that suffering is good in itself. That the value of suffering is it makes you think. Simple as that. It makes you stop and think. It makes you question. That's its spiritual value. Hasn't got value outside of that. Well, it has actually, but not in itself. I'll try and come on to that. But Bhante Sangha actually talks about the spiritual danger of happiness. Because when you're happy, you don't think very much. You're not very self-reflective. It's often when you suffer that makes you stop and ask questions of your life. One of the dangers of practicing Buddhism is that that's what brings you to practice Buddhism. You then start to feel better. You carry on practicing Buddhism but without much real reflection, because you start to feel okay. And then eventually suffering comes along again, and you start to think, I really must practice more. And then you start to think, okay, you feel okay again. And if you're living in Melbourne, what is there to suffer about? From so many people, you're never more than 20 minutes away from a cappuccino, are you? The best coffee in the world. What is it? I mean, we do live. Many of us do live in this terribly fortunate bubble, don't we? Well, that's interesting. We were talking, weren't we, in the car about that, and I've been thinking more and more about. This is a bit of a side point, but this is not a talk. This is just a ramble going on about stuff. I've been thinking more about this whole question of privilege, because I was very struck by our conversation in the car, just about your working with people who have been victims of torture, and it's very. To sort of bring that into a sunny day in Melbourne for me is an important thing to keep bringing in. It's unthinkable, and one shouldn't trespass. One shouldn't trespass onto those people's experience, because compared to them, we have nothing to complain about, and never will have, never had. And the tendency then to think that therefore we're privileged, and I've become more and more uneasy about this language of privilege. It's becoming very politicized, and the danger of the language is it's got a subtext, which is that you've got it coming, that you're privileged, you shouldn't be privileged, that you've taken it off someone, you've got it coming. That's what seems to have morphed with that language. You talk about white privilege and male privilege and so on. It's a very un-Buddhist way of approaching it, I think. I want to talk more and more about that you're lucky, that I'm lucky, that you're lucky. You're lucky you weren't born in most of the places in the world. You're really lucky. Most of the places, you're really lucky you weren't born in those places. I'm really lucky that I was born in a small town in Warwickshire. Even though, it wasn't without its suffering, without any doubt. There's no life without its suffering. I'll come back to that. But I think it's much better to, instead of thinking in terms of privilege, think in terms of good fortune. Because then it's very clear what the ethics of good fortune are. So I think there's three elements, ethics of good fortune. First of them is to feel grateful for your good fortune. Really, really grateful. You're very, very lucky. Anyone who can sit in this room and sort of happily, you're very fortunate. So the ethics of being fortunate is to feel grateful for it, isn't it? So I think that's the first thing. The second ethics of good fortune is to spread it around. It's ignoble to be fortunate and to keep that good fortune to yourself. So your ethical responsibility, if you're fortunate, and that's what we are, we're not privileged, because you see how that makes it like there's something that you've taken, and probably none of you have taken anything more than any other human being. You're not robber barons and so on. But you are fortunate. So let's be grateful to all those things that have created that fortune, including your country and so on, your parents. Let's be grateful to them. Grateful to the police. All sorts of things that we take for granted, but which are terrifying if you can't take it for granted. For law and order, things like that. For a law that is, it's problematic, but incredible achievement in many respects. So then not to squander your good fortune, which means to make sure that as many people as benefit from your own good fortune as possible. And I think the third and most difficult element of this ethic, I think, and I think it's a more Buddhist approach, is to make the most of your good fortune, not to squander it. And I think that's our great sin, to use that very Christian word, is that we don't make enough of our good fortune. And I include myself, that we're hugely fortunate, and I'm not grateful enough, I don't spread it around enough, and I don't make enough of my good fortune. I can practice the Dharma, I can be friends with people, I can do good things, and I don't do enough of that. Do you see how that's a much more demanding ethic than thinking that you're privileged, actually, strangely? And do you see how it's individual? And that's what Buddhist ethics is. It's about your sovereign individuality. So are you grateful enough for your good fortune? Are you spreading your good fortune around enough? The answer will be no to a lot, to that, quite a lot. There are things you can do about that. There are things that you can be more, you can express gratitude more, you can give more. That people who are fortunate, the ethical thing to do is give from that fortune, if you see what I mean. And you can make the most of your good fortune, and making the most of your good fortune from a traditional Dharmic point of view is practicing the Dharma for the welfare of all, and really communicating the Dharma to as many people as possible, so they can change their minds and so on. In other words, to go considerably out of your way to help others. Just see how I think, if you think of it like that, fortune and luck, even though it sounds less, actually the implications for your day-to-day life, you can start to do something about that good fortune tomorrow, tonight. You can't do very much about privilege apart from feel slightly guilty about it, and that is not in your interest, and it's not in anybody else's interest, because when you feel guilty about things, you start to feel resentful of things, and you get into all sorts of problems. Guilt is again, going back to the image, that's one of the dangers of that image is the inculcation of guilt. Nobody knows what the etymology of guilt is. So it's this horrible feeling, but you don't quite know what it is. And human beings don't like having horrible feelings that they don't know what they are, so they act out on them in all sorts of unhelpful and unhealthy ways. And we've seen that, haven't we, very, very strongly from religious traditions, where that's just been that guilt has been acted out in unhelpful and unhealthy ways. It's very, very dangerous, guilt. Spiritually, it's extremely corrosive. I think I've been very prone to guilt. When you talk, you always sort of say more about yourself than sometimes. Anyway, getting back to this painting. So first thing that strikes me is suffering. Yeah. The fact of suffering. And remember, the Buddha said, "I teach suffering and the end of suffering." Yeah. In other words, I don't teach theory. I don't teach ideology. I'm not teaching a kind of political system. I'm not teaching how we could rearrange ourselves societally. I teach suffering and the end of suffering. So if that's what you're interested in, I can help you. He's not saying he knows. He's not. That's what he's saying. His field is, yeah, suffering and the end of suffering. the thing we have to caveat with that with is that what the Buddha means by suffering is not what we mean by suffering. It includes what we mean by suffering, but it goes far beyond it. He means us suffering. He doesn't mean those people suffering. He means your suffering. He includes suffering in the gross, in that awful sense, but anything outside of enlightenment for the Buddha is suffering. Yeah. So the Buddhist vision of suffering is vast. Yeah. It includes the dhyanas. All of those, from the enlightened perspective, are sufferings. Only the Buddha isn't suffering in that sense. Yeah. So then what struck me in the painting, and we were talking about, is that actually the painting is all painted on gold leaf background. It's on a wooden board. It's on gold leaf. So the hands and the faces, and I think my guess was one of the faces is... anyway, who is the king who... I can't remember, don't worry about that. Anyway, there's all these faces, and they're all on this gold leaf. And that represents the kingdom of heaven. It represents... The gold leaf in paintings always represents what we would call the transcendent. It represents, traditionally it would represent the kingdom of heaven, represents Godhead and so on. But what struck me about the painting is one of the many things that makes it so beautiful is that there's suffering that is so empathically painted by Memling is on this ground of transcendence, on this gold leaf. So it's not a natural sky. In traditional Christian iconography, the sky is always gold, pretty much. It's quite later on that you get a blue sky. So, do you see how I find that a very potent metaphor that you've got suffering, human suffering. We have to translate it into Buddhist terms, but you've got human suffering, and that without that gold background, it would be unbearable and utterly destructive, because there'd be no way out of it. So what you've got, what you've got in the painting is redemption through the kingdom of heaven, through Godhead. Yeah. Now, I don't have that, and I've never had that. I've never believed in God. I've never believed in the kingdom of heaven. But as an image, I find myself in deep agreement with that. If you only had suffering, human life would be unbearable. And the thing is that our suffering, unlike the image of the man of sorrows, our suffering is very hidden from us. I won't go into that too much because it would take too long, but our suffering is very hidden from us. So we still have slaves, don't we, for instance? We just hide them. I've got a beautiful new iBook, iMac, anyway, one of them laptopy things. That it's made by people in terrible conditions. So they're basically slaves, really. They're just slaves that have been popped somewhere else, so you don't have the inconvenience of them having around on the streets and the pang to your conscience that would cause. Yeah. So you've got suffering, and then you've got, in the painting, you've got redemption. And there's a relationship between suffering and redemption in the Christian iconography. And I think there's... And I think the reason that these images have survived is not so much because of Christian theology, because the images themselves and the stories touch on something primary about us. I think what Buddhism does is answer those questions more clearly and less dangerously. These two things go together. You've got this fact of human suffering, and then you've got something that redeems it, which is gold, and gold is the most precious thing in the world. It's beautiful, it's precious, it's in the painting, of course, it's completely other than the world. That used to mean. And there's problems in that, because that's the problem of the kingdom of heaven is if you create a redemption that's completely other than the world, do you see how you then make the world into something that you're just trying to get away from? Something horrible, something disgusting. And that's partly what the image is trying to do, is that this world is a world of suffering. You need to get away from this world and you need to get to this other world. Now that's in my mind a distorted attempt to say something very true, which is that human life is riven with suffering. It's not all suffering, but there's an awful lot of it. You know, you can see why the Buddha said life is suffering. And if you haven't experienced that much yet, you will. And you know, many of us have been we're very fortunate, so we won't have experienced the terrible sufferings that some people do. But one's suffering is one's own suffering. It's interesting, you know, talking in the car, and the sufferings of others should touch us much more deeply than they do. But your own suffering, you know, you can know other things about what happens to other people, but your own suffering is no less painful for that, is it? I was talking to a very young friend of mine who's only 21, and he was talking about his girlfriend leaving him when he's 21. And he's a singer-songwriter, and he was saying how painful that was. And he said, "Look, I must stop writing love songs." He's only 21 for him. I said, "You've got at least 20 years left of your love songs in you yet. You know, you can't be thinking of stopping writing love songs now." But then do you remember how painful that was when you're 21? Unbearable. I remember, I thought, oh God, I've forgotten just how painful that was when you're in love with someone and they go off. Awful, the first time that happens. And it's no good saying to that person, but so other people suffer more, because they'd agree with that. But there's something about your own suffering that is ineluctable. You can't get around it. So, you know, suffering is written into the very fabric of human existence. There's no existence without it. So for me, the image of the man of sorrows, I translate that into a Buddhist thing that, look, you need to face up, you need to face suffering. And what Buddhism would say about that, first of all, is you need to take responsibility for it. You need to see more and more clearly that you're causing an awful lot of it. In fact, Buddhism would say you're probably causing kind of most of it. Buddhism is extremely unfair in that way. It doesn't let you off. It doesn't say, yeah, no, how terrible, God, that's awful. You know, it doesn't let you off. It says, you know, most of your suffering is caused by your mind. Buddhism is, you know, the most vicious of religions. You know, it won't let you off at all. It shouldn't do. And we must be very, very careful not to soften it. I had this experience of my own suffering a few years ago when my partner, for want of a better term, I found some slightly incriminating evidence that he had been, anyway, etc. And I said, look, I did a typical Woody Allen, you know, I said, you know, just tell me what's going on, and, you know, because I want to know the truth, you know. And he told me, well, I've been having a relationship with this Cuban guy for the last 6 years, and I'm thinking of moving into London. And I had a complete meltdown. I mean, it's classic Woody Allen thing, you know, just tell me the truth, and, you know, that's all I want, and then you tell the truth, and you have a complete meltdown, you know. And you think, well, that's why people don't tell the truth, because they know that you'll have a complete meltdown. But I found it, you know, terribly painful. Terribly painful. You know, because I've been in a relationship with him since before I was a Buddhist, and we have an open relationship. Not that that means very much from my side, because you need. Anyway, there's hardly been an orderly queue, but you know, I had this. Basically, I remember feeling I felt such a fool. Why didn't I? You know, he'd been going to Cuba all the time. Well, what did I expect? You know, I felt such a fool. But found it terribly painful. After all those years of spiritual practice, it was only, I don't know, 6 years ago or something, 5 years ago even. After all that years, I felt such a fool that I had been leaning on something, and suddenly, what was I thinking? Whatever was I thinking? I remember feeling, really, I kept saying, I feel such a fool. But the chaos you get tipped, I don't know whether it's ever happened to you, the chaos you get tipped into, and it's not just what I thought was true wasn't true, or wasn't true. It's like your world kind of breaks a bit. It's like, I thought I was standing on something, I'm not standing on anything at all. And this was off lots of practice. And all I kept saying to myself is that the reason this is painful is because of my attachment. That is why it's painful. If I wasn't attached, this would not be painful, because it's not unreasonable. This guy, the guy he went off with, much younger, much better looking than me, hard to believe. But it's not unreasonable, you know what I mean? And I could easily imagine it happening to me, you know. One wants to cast that person as, oh, they've done this terrible thing. But actually, you know, we're all capable of doing it, and before you know it, we're not such moral saints. I haven't met many saints in my life, and if I do, I'm extremely suspicious. But so I was really just trying to keep on holding to this is my attachment. It's not an unreasonable thing. I haven't done anything wrong. It's my attachment. Very, very difficult to do. So the first thing that Buddhism says, you have to really take responsibility for pain. Yeah, that if you're experiencing pain, probably it's to do with your mind. It's probably to do with your attachment. It's probably to do with your egotism. Now, Buddhism is completely unforgiving in that way. It won't let you blame anyone. It won't let you make yourself into a victim. It's very tempting. There's a whole new kind of victim mentality abroad, a kind of grievance culture, and you know, I can see partly why that, you know, as with any culture, it's trying to touch at something, and you know, because there have been grievances that haven't been seen, you know, haven't been brought to light, and it's good that they're being brought to light. But the danger of it is that you end up feeling, everyone at the moment sort of queuing up to be to feel aggrieved by things. It's very, very, it really isn't in your own interests. I used to feel very much a victim of my brothers, you know, that my brothers were very cruel to me when I was young. And I was a victim of them in many ways. But thinking myself in that way is really unhelpful and utterly un-Buddhist. Actually, now that I've got children in my own life, I know what it's like to have a child around who's in a bad mood all the time and who's constantly upset. It's such a drag, isn't it? Because all the other children, everyone else is having fun, and they're like... when Ria does it, it's like a massive mope. Although then I wrote to somebody on my phone saying, you know, Ria's in a mope, and she read it. Well, I'm not in a mope. So do delete your text when you send. You know, and I was very like that. I was always upset. I was always grumbling. I now know what that's like to have that around. I did at the time. I just felt, and nobody understands me. People don't love me. You know, they were horrible to me. I didn't see my side in it. You know, so Buddhism wants to, first of all, is to take full responsibility for your own life. It's easy to say, easy to write about, really, really difficult to do. I mean, like, massively difficult to do. My example for it recently was I was going to Dublin, and when I travel, I get into this very dreamy kind of poetic mood. That might write a little, you know, ta-da, isn't it nice? Because I'm not I'm not in my computer anymore, and there's the fields going past, and gosh, I'm flying, how romantic. And I looked at my watch and I thought, that's funny. Looks like it says 20 to 2, and my flight is at 2:30, and I'm actually like nowhere near the airport. And I looked at it for ages. I thought, oh my God, And, you know, I'd just been in this dreamy thing where I hadn't got the train earlier enough. And immediately, in my mind, I started blaming. I thought, I can't believe this train's so slow. This is the Gatwick Express. What kind of express is this? I've been on the train, and then I got to the airport. Oh my God, look at these queues. They're so slow. What's that person doing? Excuse me, person. Can you serve me, please? And I had to keep saying, Maitreyabandhu, this is your fault. You did not leave early enough. But very, very difficult to do. Really, like a deep human instinct to say, I can't believe the trains, what these ridiculous queues, why don't they have more staff? But very trivial thing like that, but really strong impulse to blame.
Yeah? Did you catch the blame?
I did, yes. What, really? And then I've used it for talks ever since. But what struck me was how my instinct is to blame. Very, very. Buddhism's trying to turn your instinct around and say, okay, so you did not leave early enough. Can you learn this about that? So first of all, it would say take responsibility for suffering. It would be saying, and no, you can't get to feel a victim. No. That's too easy. You don't blame people for it. Blame never works, including blaming yourself. Blame actually is, I think, probably a Christian idea. It means that it started somewhere. So, when you tell the story of Christ, of course, what you get is anti-Semitism. Because who caused it? It was the Jews. Every time you tell the story of the Passion, you get a new wave of anti-Semitism. Mel Gibson's film recently was criticised because of its anti-Semitic sense, and it created more anti-Semitism, but that's because it comes in. They're the baddies in the story. They were the ones to blame. You see, any blame, it just doesn't. It makes them to a first cause. People then forget, of course, that Jesus was Jewish and so on. So blame, including blaming yourself, never works. So you have to take this very difficult burden of responsibility. You need to be able to say, that was my fault. You need to be able to then say, I'm really sorry about that was my fault. I have to blame for that. You can say that. But in the painting, you've then got this gold, Otherwise, Buddhism would be... So I'm translating this painting. I've looked at paintings so much, I translate them completely in my head, and I'm not always sure whether people get that, but I'm not trying to teach the Man of Sorrows. But for me, that gold is the gold of the Buddha. It's the gold of enlightenment. It's the gold of the jewel, whatever one call it. None of these languages quite work for me, but meaning and value and purpose and so on. The difference, of course, with Buddhism is that it's not another world. Very important difference. Because if you make another world, you subjugate this world, and you say that this world is a fallen world and a sinful world, and this world is not a fallen world, it's a saved world. I can't remember whether it was here as talking about the Catholic Church and compulsory celibacy. What a stupid idea was that? You could write the rest of the history of the get young men, say that who are idealistic, and say, tell you what, great ideals, you have to be celibate to do that. What a stupid thing to do. It's all very well to talk about the individuals, but you see how an idea itself is extremely dangerous. These little things in our head called ideas, absolutely deadly, can't they? Absolutely, they can be wonderful and absolutely disastrous across great swathes of history. But you see how that comes from a dualistic thing. You've got a fallen world you need to get away from, and a saved world you need to get towards. Buddhism doesn't do that, but you see how what we're getting in contemporary Buddhism is we haven't got any gold at all. What we've got is a secular Buddhism and a technique of working with difficulty. That is rubbish. That is not Buddhism. That's nothing remotely like Buddhism. All you've got in Buddhism is the Buddha saying any way of talking about that gold, to use that metaphor, it's a metaphor. Metaphors mean something, they don't mean nothing, but they're not literal. He'd say something like, well, any way of talking about that, you'll get that wrong. you'll misunderstand it. You'll either think it's a literally existing nirvana which you can go to and get away from this world, or you'll misunderstand it in some other weird and wonderful way. So let's not go there. I mean, this is what the Buddha was like. He just said, what you need to do, let me just teach you how to meditate first. Let me just help you work with your mind. What's going on for you? What is the suffering you're causing yourself? Let's see how we can start to move away from that. We'll get to other stuff later. Yeah. Actually, I don't think we can do that now. We need to teach vision much more. It's just very difficult to, because the goal of the Buddhist vision is not another world, but also it's not this world. What Buddhism is trying to say is there's a wholly other way of functioning in the world. There's a new kind of consciousness. The trouble is, consciousness is problematic because that makes it sound like it's interior, but there's another option. You've got, how can you say that? I can never. That was just noises. What these Buddha figures around the room represent, we know, don't they, they're not literal deities. They don't exist in some other world. But golly, they're not. You won't be able to meet them in the cafe. They're metaphoric, but they're not. That doesn't mean to say they don't exist. What Buddhism is trying to get at is that there is another way, wholly another way of being and acting in the world, which, if you were to paint it, would be a gold background upon which all of life is written, and which all of life emerges from and dissolves back into. In Buddhism, that is the reality that we flourish from, not some fallen reality. It's not that if you get to the core of us you find something rotten. If you get to the core of us, the genuine core of us, you find the Buddha figures. How I've been thinking about this, and I'll finish with this, otherwise I could go on forever. How I've been thinking about this is a bit going back to you saying to me, what kind of Buddhist isn't interested in Buddhist things. And I do find that a bit of a worry sometimes. But, I don't know whether you had this experience, and I'm sure many of you had, that you came here to the Melbourne Buddhist Centre, or I cycled to the London Buddhist Centre when I was 25. I was living in a squat in Brixton, I cycled in the snow, I was at art school. And I went into the room, there was a golden figure of the Buddha. I remember thinking how embarrassingly ridiculous, they've got a gold figure, I was at Goldsmiths College with Damien Hirst and people like that. One didn't do gold figures, that was so then, so Victorian. I remember thinking how ridiculous and thinking how wonderful at the same moment. I was taught to meditate, and I knew immediately I was a Buddhist. I'd always been a Buddhist, and I always would be a Buddhist. But what strikes me, thinking back on that now, is Buddhism was something I met at the London Buddhist Centre, and I feel eternally grateful to, because heaven knows what would have happened to me without it. And I feel especially grateful to my precious teacher, Bhante, without whom I would not have been interested in Buddhism, because I'm not very attracted to its cultural forms. It doesn't particularly touch me, and I don't think I would have been touched by Buddhism in its cultural forms. It doesn't do it for me. I feel particularly grateful to Bhante. But do you feel, I don't know whether you feel this, it feels like there's something in me which preceded Buddhism, which was Buddhist, if you see what I mean, and which matched Buddhism when I met it. It was like recognising myself, if you see what I mean. So whatever does that mean? Can't get much more mysterious than that. When people say they discover Buddhism, and to the degree to which they really have, it's not something outside of themselves, is it? It's more like, the face before you were born. It's more like sort of recognizing something in you. It's more like, oh yeah, I've been trying to say that. It's as if something before consciousness finds its matière, finds its meaning in these images. Finds this meaning in this atmosphere. Because for many people it's not even the images, it's a kind of vibe that seems to be amongst us. I've just flown from the other side of the world and led the Maitryabandhu, and I could have been leading it at the London Buddhist Centre, however many 1,000 miles away. Same vibe, really, effectively. I feel I feel very, very at home here. As you can tell, because I'm going on. But you see what I mean? You go to, it's not like you discover Buddhism and think, oh gosh, how interesting. Perhaps you do, and there's lots to learn. I'm not trying to undermine that there is everything to learn, and that everything to learn about Buddhism never stops, by the way. You never learn Buddhism. It's not something that you master. But it's much more mystical than that, isn't it? It's also sort of going to the... It's like in the painting, the gold is behind everything, but it's also behind everything interiorly. It's what lies behind your heart. It's what lies behind your instincts. It's something that you recognise, but that seems to precede consciousness. I want to try and explore this a bit more, if I can, on the retreat. But there's something that seems to precede consciousness that you recognise, that has got an outward-facing thing that we're calling Buddhism, and an inward-facing element which we're calling me in my life. And when it becomes the Dharma is when the two things touch. When your life and the infinite minutiae of your life seem to have behind them a gold backing. Even seem to be part of that gold. Even the difficulties of your life, like the painting, that there's some relationship between your own particular suffering, in all of its minute particularity, and some sort of gold, some as if it's trying to sort of teach you something. And you see how that image, I think, is a distorted way of saying that. Inevitably distorted, and my way of saying it is a distorted way of saying it as well. But it's getting at something, and perhaps you can never say what it's getting at, but there's something that precedes you that seems to be Buddhist, or seems to be of the nature of the Dharma, which is a bit like that gold on the back of the painting. And I think that unless I have some sense of that gold, all I've got is this. I might not have a suffering life, but I've got a life that's terribly boring and terribly tedious, terribly prosaic, one thing after another, without any shine to it. And I think so many people are suffering from lack of that gold. And that gold isn't found somewhere else, even in this somewhere else called Buddhism. It's found in the deepest sort of excavations of your experience, internally and externally. That's what we need, isn't it? Because what the gold does in the painting is that it doesn't take away suffering. It gives it this incredible context. It recontextualizes it so that suffering becomes meaningful. That's what Buddhism is trying to do. But it does it in a much more cogent, less distorted way, I think. I would say that, of course, but and we'll never get to the end of trying to explain that, but that's what it's doing, I think. So we'd better finish there. Yeah.
Thank you very much.